Welcome back, I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to take a look at the San Martin Blue BB58 Homage, or as they call it, the SN008-G Retro Ghost. And I have to tell you that this is probably the best BB58 homage out there. This is a watch that I've been thinking about and wanting to see for quite a while. In fact, when I looked at the San Martin Retro Subby a while ago, I kept wishing that looked more like this. Now, the reason we're looking at this now, as some of you may have guessed, is because of the Aliexpress 11/11 sale. Someone from Aliexpress reached out to me a while ago with a list of watches that were going to be included, and they asked if there was anything there I'd be interested in seeing. So I skimmed the list looking for this specific watch, and luckily it was there. So this seemed like a perfect opportunity to check it out. And in full disclosure, they did send me this watch for free, and they're not asking for it back. Now, as far as Aliexpress watches go, this one is a bit more than the usual, so be prepared for a little bit of sticker shock here, as this one is usually sitting around $300 to $450, just depending on which movement you want to get. And at that price, it does beg the question if it's worth it. So let's dive in and find out. If you happen to recall the Retro Ghost I looked at earlier, a lot of the design aspects are going to be very similar, specifically the case and the bracelets. But even with those, there are some significant differences. Mainly the 58 here is going to be a little bigger at 40 millimeters compared to the 38 millimeter of the Subby, as well as the 58 here is 1 millimeter thinner at 11.8. Now, for me, that 40 millimeter really hits the sweet spot on my 7¼ inch wrist. And I think that larger size works especially well with this blue colorway, as I think it has a much more contemporary feel, at least compared to its black and gold brother. But even with that, I do find it a tad curious they went with 40 millimeters here. Because if they were really trying to replicate that retro styling which made the Subby so popular, they should have kept this under 40 millimeters. Now, rounding out the specs, you're also looking at a 48 millimeter lug-to-lug, which, thanks to its newer female end links, really wears true to that. As well as a 20 millimeter lug width, a rather shallow domed sapphire crystal, 200 meters of water resistance, and either a PT5000 or a Sellita SW200 movement. On the wrist, the 58 Homage is fantastic. There's no other way to put it. And a large part of that is due to this great bracelet, which is a nice taper that goes from 20 down to 16 before a great milled clasp. With my 7¼ inch wrist, a 40 by 48 footprint is nearly perfect. And with this watch being so thin and thus having a lower center of gravity, it sits perfectly where it needs to and feels balanced with the bracelet. So this is one that should feel great on the wrist, assuming you actually got it sized perfectly, which can be a trick we'll talk about later. The case design is also going to feel very familiar, as it's really coming from the same Subby lineage we've seen time and time again. So you have flat sides with a horizontal brushing, which then meets a very slender circular brush top, both of which wind up sandwiching a nice chamfered polished edge that runs between the two. And that edge really helps to outline and just draw focus to that classic look. The only thing I would personally change with this is to add drilled lugs, as they're just so useful and a watch like this is begging to be a strap monster. The overall fit and finish is mostly good, if not great for the price, where you have nice tight-fitting end links and a very clear defined separation between the brushed and polished sections. However, there were a couple of spots I was actually disappointed in. After I was finished with my photography, which does include resting the watch on some harder surfaces, I did see a couple of noticeable scratches, one of which is on the case back, and the other two are on the back of the clasp. Now, I should stress that the watch head itself still looks perfect, so maybe these two components aren't finished with the same standards. Now, speaking of the case back, the best way to describe it here is just plain generic, as it's a screwed down closed case back with absolutely nothing on it, and that just makes the whole thing feel a little naked when you're looking at the back. Back to the front and at the right, we have a signed screw down crown. And as this is more of a retro design, there are no crown guards on either side. The crown itself is a good size, and I'd say it works rather well as intended, but there are a couple of things to note here. The first of which is that you have a big S for San Martin, which there's nothing particularly wrong with, but I really wish San Martin would start to standardize their branding across their collection. The font and the style here really don't match the case, or anything else I've seen from San Martin for that matter. So that is a little bit of a nitpick, but the other thing is more of a bigger issue, and that's with the screw down part. It's pretty tight, and does take a bit of force to screw it down properly. There were also a couple of times where I started to screw it in, and it just seemed to catch on the threading, where it'd only go a couple of rotations before stopping. Which is not necessarily a huge deal, as you just unscrew it and then redo it with a bit more force. But I think this could be a problem if you're not paying attention to it, as you might think it's actually screwed down when it's not. I'm not really sure what's causing this, but it is reproducible. And as far as build quality issues go, this is pretty much it. The rest of the watch is pretty great, and that does include the bezel. The watch uses a stainless coin-edged bezel, which has a blue ceramic insert, which should be rather tough and durable. Now the bezel isn't very tall, but it does stick out just slightly beyond the edges of the case. And with that coin edge, I think there's just enough grip that it was always very easy to turn, no matter what angle you try to grab it. The action itself here is also great, with a nice tactile and audible click as you rotate it. There is just a slight amount of back play, but this is one of those bezels that seem to be spring-loaded, where you can turn it back just slightly, but as soon as you let go, it snaps back to where it should be. The crystal is also good, and perhaps a great blend of form and function. It rises sharply out of the bezel, giving the whole thing a slight boxed look. But after that, it then tapers off to a much shallower angle as it covers the rest of the dial, resulting in a watch that has great-looking aesthetics, but still relatively thin. Let's move on to the dial, and currently San Martin has two variations of this. You have the more classic gilded version, and this newer contemporary one with a flat blue dial. In terms of design, there's really not much new here. It's pretty much the same thing we've seen with every watch with sub-EDNA. So you'll have a combination of applied dashes and dots, with a more pronounced triangle at the 12, all of which is then accompanied by a half train track chapter ring on the outer edge. What's going to be different here is the use of a snowflake handset, when that's all because it's a BB58 Homage rather than a subby. And personally, I'm a big fan of that change, as Mercedes hands these days just feel old and tired. So this thing looks great, and overall the dial appears to be fairly well executed. Everything is just sharp and well defined, even in macro. When it comes to the dial, I only really have two nitpicks with this one. The first of which is the logo under the 12. Now compared to the logo on the Retro Ghost, I like that it's rather small and applied here. But I'm really not sure about this font. And once again, San Martin really needs to be more consistent with their branding across their lineup. The other thing is that the dial as a whole does feel a little flat. The applied indices aren't very tall, and as a result, the whole thing just lacks a lot of depth. Although considering how thin this watch is, I think that is a good trade-off. Bottom line though is that this is a gorgeous looking watch, and there's not much else to say about it. It's a fairly clean, straightforward layout that looks great. It's a classic look that's very easy to use, which honestly isn't very surprising given that it is an homage. And in that regard, on the homage creativity scale, which goes from 0 to 10, I'd give this a 1. And honestly, that's even being generous. Basically, I'm giving them a point for having a slightly cleaner dial, just by forgoing the typical Great Wall of Text you normally have above the 6. One other thing I do want to mention is that I did specifically ask to see this blue version. Not only is it the version I'm more curious about, but I also noticed that with the gilded version, it seems to be using that off-yellow old radium style lume. And as we've seen time and time again, that Fadium style lume is not great when it comes to longevity, whereas this blue version appeared to be using a blue BGW9 setup. So that's what I asked for, and more importantly, that's what I wanted to test. Once again, the design here isn't that original, but San Martin did do a good job with an application of blue BGW9, as it's initially nice and bright and does have some good staying power, even slightly edging out my Seiko Turtle in regards to longevity. San Martin does have a good reputation when it comes to lume, so it's nice to see that they're really living up to that. Let's move on to the movement, and with this particular watch, you have an option for PT5000 or the more expensive Sellita SW200. So note there is no NH35A option here, which is one reason the price is a bit more. Now, since this watch was actually sent to me, I'm not 100% sure what movement is in it. If I had to guess, I'd say it's the PT5000 just because it's cheaper. The PT5000 is another ETA 2824 clone, and in that way it should be very similar to the Sellita SW200. The biggest difference is that the SW200 is going to be made in Switzerland, while the PT5000 is made in China, and it's a whole lot more affordable. Now, theoretically, they are basically the same design, so theoretically, they should offer the same performance and be just as capable. That is assuming that the PT5000 is manufactured and assembled properly, and that is sometimes the trick with these movements. In my opinion, the PT5000 hasn't quite proven itself versus some of the Swiss alternatives. And a lot of that is because I don't have a whole lot of experience with these movements. And because of that, I am hesitant to just flat out recommend them. So the SW200 is the safer choice, but the price here for the PT5000 makes it a very compelling option. And it's pretty hard to argue with the results here, as I was only gaining 4.7 seconds a day on average, which is something I can't complain about. As for the bracelet, well, the bracelet is great. It has solid female end links, and those end links have a nice tight fit with the case. You also have solid links with an additional polished side panel that creates this rivet-style bracelet. And all of that then tapers from 20mm down to 16 before hitting one of the best milled clasps I've run across. And it is definitely the best clasp I've run across on an Aliexpress watch. The clasp has this great solid feel to it, with these polished chamfered edges running down every side. There are 4 micro adjusts, but more importantly, it has a fantastic and responsive mechanism. With the clasp, the only issue I have is with the logo, because once again, I do question whether it's fitting with the watch. Now overall, it is a great bracelet, but there is one weak point to it. You know, while these rivet-style bracelets look fantastic, they are hard to size. As you have a screw head on either side, and you do need to hold one side steady while you unscrew the other. Which may not sound bad, but with these small screws, it really is a pain. And if you're not extremely careful while doing it, you will wind up with some scratch marks on the polished rivet side, just from the screwdriver slipping. So just bear that in mind going forward. And that said, if anyone has any tips to make this easier to size, please leave a comment down below. So I really only have a few nitpicks with this one, like the crown occasionally being harder to screw in, and the clasp maybe being a little too easy to scratch. But other than that, it's actually pretty fantastic. I think these are regularly around $320 for the PT5000 movement and around $450 for the version with a Sellita, which I think will be around $300 and $425 respectively with the 11/11 sale, and possibly even less with coupons. But to be honest, every time there's an Aliexpress sale, there are a ton of coupon codes and half of them don't work, and it's just confusing to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. But regardless of that, even at regular price here, I think you're getting a heck of a lot for your money. This is easily better than any $400 Seiko I've run across, and I'd say it's on par with a lot of the $400 to $500 micro brands. The only thing that really gives me pause here is that PT5000 movement, and that's just because I don't have a lot of experience with them. I'd much rather have a Sellita, but for the price, it seems pretty good, and I can't really argue with the results on this one. So in my opinion, it is totally worth it. But let's be real here. At this price, there are a ton of options out there. And at this price, you really shouldn't buy anything as an impulse buy. You really should weigh it against all those other options. For some, this is going to be exactly what they want, and the value here is going to be too irresistible. Whereas others may just want a nice original Seiko. For them, originality and creativity are worth more than sapphire and ceramic. So before you whip out any sort of credit card, just think about what you want. Now at this point, a lot of you already have experience with Aliexpress, so you don't really need to hear me say this, but I'd be kind of remiss if I don't point this out on occasion. Now if you buy any watch from Aliexpress, the odds are that everything will go fine. But there's always a little bit of risk when you're buying from Aliexpress. Now, San Martin is probably the most reputable watch seller on the platform, so you don't really need to worry about them. But there is always a risk with international shipping, and especially these days. Also, on the off chance that there's an issue with the watch, trying to get it back to China or trying to find some sort of resolution is always a little bit more complicated. Plus, the resale value on Aliexpress watches isn't always the best. But these days, San Martin is a lot more recognized than it used to be, so that's a little bit less of an issue. Now, a couple of years ago, when everyone was impulse buying $60 Cadisons, that was one thing. But when you're talking about a $300 to $500 watch, it's a whole other story. So this is stuff you should at least think about. Now, that said, this is an awesome watch. So if you really love the look or you're really interested in getting a BB Homage, this is probably the one you want to get. But what do you think about this one? Is it worth it, or is it just another Homage to avoid? Let me know down below. And if there's anything else that's caught your eye in the Aliexpress sale, let me know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.